Thank you, everybody. Welcome. It's a pleasure to continue our CCIS workshops here at UC San Diego today in collaboration with the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration and the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies. My name is Claire Edita. I am professor of political science at UC San Diego and director of CCIS, the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Thym. Dr. Thym is the Jean Monnet Chair of European, International, and Public Law at the University of Constance in Germany. His research revolves around the multiple dimensions of European migration law, which he uses to capture both voluntary and forced migration. His approach is a holistic outlook on the legal rules, the policy debates, and everyday practices at the national, continental, and international levels. And while he's a visiting scholar at CCIS this year, Dr. Thym is working on a book on the legal, political, and societal implications of Germany's increasing self-perception as a country of immigration, especially drawing insights from the US experience as a long-standing country of immigration. This is a fundamentally interdisciplinary approach that will greatly benefit from the CCIS community, and that will be a great contribution to the CCIS community. So today, Dr. Thym is going to give us a bird's eye view on the European approach to border control and migration law. And he's going to be drawing from his most recent book from June 2023, published by Oxford University Press, called European Migration Law. So what we're going to do today is Dr. Thym is going to present for about 25 to 30 minutes. And then we're just going to go straight to opening up the floor for Q&A. And I will moderate that. So you could either raise your hand and I can call on you and you can speak up. Or if you'd rather not, you can also write out your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. I am hearing some chatter in the Zoom room, so please mute yourselves if you can. Thank you very much. Before we move on to Dr. Thym's presentation, just a shout out to our next presentation in a couple of weeks, again, co-sponsored with UCLA's Center for the Study of International Migration. It will be Friday, November 17th via Zoom. It's a presentation by Dr. Nancy Fauner entitled "One Quarter of the Nation, Immigration and the Transformation of America." But for now, let's turn our attention to Dr. Thym, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks indeed, Claire, for the kind invitation, and thanks all of you for being present today. I have a PowerPoint to accompany this because the law is, of course, quite abstract and sometimes also dull in the eyes of others, but I hope that this comparison between Europe and the US is somewhat interesting to all of you. Regarding my focus, border policy is, of course, very broad. I will focus on one element of it, which is, of course, the controversial element concerning asylum and irregular entries. That is, of course, a deliberate focus because the European Union and its member states, like all the other countries, so that these bona fide travelers like Americans can enter the EU in a couple of minutes. So they are not hindered, to the contrary, they are invited and they can enter as quickly as possible. And the other side of the coin is, of course, asylum and the irregular entries via the green land and the blue sea border. And here the European situation is a bit different from the American one insofar as we are confronted with different border segments, not only one, the southern US border towards Mexico, but we have different border segments which are in the limelight, and the geopolitical and also factual context is different in all these border segments. I will today not delve into the details of the different elements. What I will do instead is I will zoom out and approach European border policy at an intermediate level of abstraction, and in doing so I will not actively compare Europe to the US. I've rather made an attempt to choose my examples so that those of you who are familiar with the American situation, and which I think all of you are, can draw the parallelisms and also the differences by themselves. When we now look at the European external borders, and by external borders, I mean the external borders of the Schengen area, the countries which have abolished internal border controls and have instead established a common external border, we see that we have had 280,000 irregular entries so far. That at a purely numerical level is quite comparable to the American situation. And there is a different number which shows you how sensitive the issue is. According to IOM, the International Organization for Migration, almost 2,500 are dead and missing. They have died in the attempt to cross the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe. And the central Mediterranean, this is the segment between Italy and Tunisia, is the most deadly migration route in the world, much more deadly also than the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama. So I will spare you the detail about the specific border situation. Instead, I will zoom out and present more abstract views. For you being able to follow what I'm going to say, it's necessary to highlight some very few things about the EU some of you might not be familiar with. The European Union is a very strange creature in many respects. It's neither an international organization nor a federal state. It's something in between. And that means also that it's very lopsided. On the one hand, we have a very high degree of legal integration, but a very low degree of political integration. What does that mean? In practice, it means that European law, what I'm dealing with, prevails over state law, member state law in cases of conflict. It's pretty much like the relationship between federal American law and American state law. So in that respect, it's pretty much like a federal state, but at the same time, the political discourse, citizen identification, and party politics remain predominantly national. So in that respect, when we approach it from a more political perspective, it's more like an international organization. Moreover, European federalism is quite different from the American variant of federalism. And I mention that because it can become quite important to understand what is happening in Europe and also to understand what is happening in the US. In Europe, the standard situation is that the European Union adopts legislation. This legislation is then specified by national parliaments and applied by domestic authorities, meaning it's not the US separation model where we have federal laws which are applied by federal border agents, but we have federal EU legislation, which is then applied by domestic authorities. So disputes like the current dispute in Texas about Operation Lone Star, what can states do? Besides, federal law is something which wouldn't occur in Europe. States have some flexibility, but they must with respect EU law when doing so. So in very practice, that means that at the external border, you have Italian border guards enforcing EU law at the borders of Italy, and you have Polish border guards enforcing EU law at the border between Poland and Belarus. In addition, there are some agencies, some federal offices, in particular Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, and EUAA, the European Union Agency for Asylum. They are proto-federal units, border guards, and also asylum agencies. They are very visible in the political debate. They are also very visible in the academic debate. They are fascinating objects of study if you want to write a legal PhD. But the bottom line is that they have no autonomous operational powers and competences. They focus on assisting and supporting member states. The ultimate responsibility to take decision rests with the member states, And indeed, EU agents are absent at many segments of the border. So when we go back to these pictures, we have some European staff in Poland, some in Greece, and a few people in Italy, but only in the background. All the rest of the work is done by national border guards and national agencies implementing European Union law. So that is the more somehow political and not political, legal, constitutional introduction, which might be necessary to understand what I'm going to say with regard to the substance. And I will do so in 3 steps. I will first talk a bit more abstract about the self-image which Europe has of itself and how it has changed in recent years. I will then look at the very high degree of legal protection within the territory, the very generous internal asylum regime which the European Union has, which differs quite substantially from the American situation. And I will then contrast it to what is usually called externalisation. That means attempts by the member states to circumvent their own generous internal regime by means of cooperation with third states. All that in 30 minutes. And I'll start with the self-image between values and what is often called by critics mainly Fortress Europe. I don't see your pictures, only a few, mainly of the person who are like myself, of 40 plus. I turned 50 3 weeks ago, meaning that the defining period of my life was the 1990s. And that is why I could call myself and also the other older participants in the room the end of history generation. What do I mean? I and maybe some others, the older people in the room, belong to a generation which grew up during a time when it seemed that democracy and human rights had really won the struggle with competing ideologies, and there was a lot of optimism about globalization. And the European Union was in many respects the ideal epitomization of this dream of an end of history. In the 1990s, the European Union established a common citizenship. I'm not only a German national, I'm also an EU citizen. The European Court of Human Rights advanced the human rights of migrants as an international court. Border controls were abolished within Europe, and more states, which were former communist dictatorships, lined up to join the European Union. So it really seemed as if in Europe, a new model of what was called in the academic debate post or supranational membership would develop. And what does that again mean? The prototypical academic reference is Jasmine Soysal, The Limits of Citizenship, and she argued that developments within Europe with regard to citizenship, free movement, borders, and human rights indicated that classical notions of national belonging are increasingly supplanted and replaced by universal membership ideas based on human rights. That was, of course, always a bit Eurocentric. With the wisdom of hindsight, we can say so. It was also a bit simplistic because EU integration was mainly about some sort of quasi-state formation, so internal unity. It was never really supposed to be about universal equality, but be it as it may, this idea that the European Union epitomizes the end of history, the victory of human rights, the end also of the nation state was very widely shared in the academic literature. Things have changed, of course, and I think we have a second group besides the end of history generation among the participants. And the majority of participants is certainly attending university at the moment as undergrad or grad students or postdocs. And you may find our perspective on migration, which many of us shared in the 1990s, somewhat naive. And why? Because you grew up with images like the one on the right side, borders, restrictions, and states somehow fighting back against human rights, if you want to use the competitive language. And that is, of course, quite appropriate, especially in the European context. Just let me remind you of the 2,500 people who are dead or missing in the Mediterranean this year. And I also chose these pictures deliberately. First, because you have this border wall fence, which is still being built between Mexico and the US. And we now have the same in Europe. It's a fairly new development. It only started 8 years ago. It's reasonably new. But over the past 5 or 6 years, more and more states have started building these fences. You see Finland, Poland, Spain, and Hungary on the 4 pictures. I'm fully aware that I'm somehow simplifying a much more complex story, but you will ideally see in a minute what I'm preparing the ground for. The European Union itself has always described itself in language which very much mirrors this end of history dream. And one reason why this ideal of human rights and universalism was so attractive to the EU is precisely because it was a non-state entity. So it couldn't rely on national myths, founding myths, or national notions of communitarian belonging. And arguably, this very generous internal self-image is one of the reasons why it adopted fairly generous internal asylum legislation over the past 30 years, to which I will come back in a second. And I've also give you a somehow quintessential expression of that self-image of the European Union. First, the graphic, that's a typical graphical design you would find on the EU website, or would have found on the EU's website 10, 20 years ago. And I've also given you, that's the bottom left, Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. That's the EU's founding treaty, its constitution, so to say. And the very second article says the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. And as we shall see, that idea very much informed the internal legislation adopted in recent years. Things have changed quite remarkably, and I'm running short of time, so I will really be very short. I've only give you one example. That is the Austrian Freedom Party. It's one of these populist parties which have now even started embracing the idea of Fortress Europe as a positive narrative to support, to see European integration. And they apply that primarily to Austria, but I'm pretty sure that in the next European election, which will happen next year, they will also apply it to Europe. So there are people who have embraced Fortress Europe, and even more moderate politicians have moved away from this human rights only language. They focus illegal migration, and they focus a Europe that protects. So the discourse has shifted, and not only the discourse has shifted, also the policy priorities. I'll give you 2 examples regarding the fairly generous internal asylum regime. And I will focus the first example on the very right to apply for asylum. You have on the top left, you have Article 3 of the Asylum Procedures Directive of the European Union. And there it says that the directive shall apply to all applications for international protection made in the territory, including at the border, in the territorial waters, or in transit zones. That is only one article. There are 54 more articles on 27 single-digit pages, 27 pages with very small print, which specify what that means. And it really means what it says. Once someone has applied for asylum, he must be admitted on the territory to receive a procedure there. You can discuss what exactly at the border means. It's probably not enough to stand at a fence and to shout across the fence, I want asylum, and then you must be admitted to the territory. But once you are at a border crossing point, or once you cross irregularly, you have that right to apply for asylum. And the European Court of Justice has reaffirmed that right on numerous occasions. And more specifically, that means that you can apply for asylum with any state authority, including border guards. If that happens, they must channel you in the asylum procedure on the territory. It does not matter whether your claim is manifestly unfounded or whether you come from a so-called safe third country, that's all irrelevant. Whether that is the case or not must be determined in the asylum procedure. And for that purpose, you must be admitted on the territory. Something like this restriction of applications for asylum to border crossing points, which the US did in 2017-18, or Title 42, the suspension of asylum claims during COVID, all that would be obviously illegal on the European continent. And also something like remain in Mexico would not be possible, because whether a third country is safe and whether in a very specific individual case someone can be returned to a safe third country is something which must be determined in the asylum procedure. And I'll skip the safe third countries and I will focus on another element, and that is the extraterritorial application of human rights. So what did states do when they realized that they have adopted this wonderful, generous legislation and that they have no option, legally speaking, not to grant individuals access to asylum? They thought, wow, great, let's do something else. Let's just stop the people before they arrive at the border. So they embarked on border controls on the high seas, because many people enter Europe via the Mediterranean, and they stopped the people and sent them back to countries such as Libya. And Italy is a country which started doing so in the late 2000s, based on an agreement with the former Libyan dictator. And on one occasion in 2009, they stopped 3 boats with 200 people. They just sent them back to Libya. They stopped them before they arrived at the Italian border. They sent them back to Libya. And there, these people were essentially left on their own devices. Some were apparently even pushed back further by Libya to Chad. They didn't receive an asylum procedure in Libya, nothing. So what did these migrants and refugees do? They went to the European Court of Human Rights, an international court whose judgments states are obliged to respect, and they actually do respect it in practice, usually at least, and domestic courts also stand ready to enforce these international judgments in domestic courts. So that's a crucial difference to the US, where international law plays hardly any relevance. And this court said, well, as a matter of principle, this European Convention of Human Rights says that human rights must only be respected by states within their jurisdiction. And that obviously usually refers to the territory, but we can also interpret jurisdiction generously. And once a state has effective control over an individual, for instance, because the individual is on a Coast Guard ship, then the European Convention applies. And for all practical purposes, that means that you cannot bring the person to Libya. What you have to do instead is you have to bring the person to Italy, because you must check whether she would be in a danger of refoulement, of illegal treatment, contrary to human rights in Libya. And that requires a procedure. You cannot just send them back to Libya. So the European Court of Human Rights famously extended human rights to extraterritorial border controls. And that's just one judgment among many others, which indicates how human rights, but also legislation, has extended the human and individual rights of migrants over the past 30 years. Many policies which happen in the US would be blatantly illegal in Europe. That does not, of course, say or mean that European states behave much better, if I may say so, than the United States. On the one hand, we have states who just violate the law and get away with it. You may have heard of the pushback allegations, with especially the Greek border guards just pushing back migrants when they try to apply for asylum. They ignore the claim for asylum and push them back. But we also have something else which is very prominent in the European debate, which also exists in the United States, but it's much less debated in the United States, both politically and academically. If you write a PhD in Europe, the likelihood that you want to deal with cooperation with third states is very high. It's much less common, to my knowledge, in the United States. And also politically speaking, whenever politicians meet and try to fix the asylum issue, cooperation with third states takes center stage. You find some quotes here on the slide. And there is one reason for this, arguably, is that the Europeans are bound by this very generous internal legislation and human rights case law, which means that if they really want to reduce substantially the number of irregular arrivals, they have to move before the territory, because once the people are at the border or on a border guard ship, you cannot do anything. So again, two short examples about, I've moved from 3 to 2 short examples about what externalization means. The first, a very basic and simple example. It's not anything new. It's something which has happened for many years. I checked again online. You can easily buy a one-way plane ticket from Lebanon, which is a country which is a neighbor to Syria, and more than 1 million Syrians are living in Lebanon, often under dire humanitarian and also economic conditions. You can buy a one-way flight ticket from Lebanon to Berlin for 170 euros. So why do Syrians in Lebanon pay much more money to smugglers to cross the Mediterranean on a boat, on a highly dangerous journey where they might die, if they can buy such a comparatively cheap flight ticket to Berlin? The answer is simple. The European Union, the Schengen area as a whole, has a visa requirement for Syrians, which has been in place for many years. So they cannot legally enter Germany. And the European states also ensure that they do not show up at the border spontaneously by just boarding a flight, by obliging aircraft staff to check entry requirements before boarding. If they bring someone who doesn't fulfill the entry requirements to Europe with a plane, they have to pay a fine, even if the person applies for asylum and has a right to apply for asylum at the border. And that works surprisingly well. It's probably the single most effective migration control element which exists. And this instrument, not element, has existed for many years, and it's fairly effective. And the European Union was instrumental in spreading visa requirements to member states who didn't previously have them. On the picture on the bottom left, you see all the red states. All these states require a visa to enter the Schengen area. And the European Union doesn't only have these requirements internally, it also obliges third states to follow these visa requirements. Last year, for instance, quite a lot of Indian and Tunisians flew to Serbia, which is not a member state of the European Union, but which is next to the European Union, without a visa, and then crossed the land border to Hungary irregularly. What did the European Union do? It exercised some pressure on Serbia, which is fairly easy because Serbia wants to join the European Union. It receives a lot of financial support. It's economically dependent on the European Union. And surprise, surprise, Serbia introduced visa requirements for India and Tunisia. Only last week, the European Commission, the European government, so to say, issued a report in which it listed in quite some details which third states should be convinced to follow the European visa regime. So that is one classic. It's nothing new. It's a classic example of what states do and what is meant by externalization. So let's move to my second and last example, the more recent one. You can describe policy developments over the last 30 years as a sort of cat and mouse game. States introduce visa requirements. What do migrants do? Well, they pay smugglers or try to reach Europe irregularly. what do states do as a result? They push back migrants. They say, we don't accept you. What does the European Court of Human Rights do as a result? It says, well, the human rights apply also extraterritorially on the high sea. You cannot just push them back. That's illegal. So what happens next? Member states stop. They retreat more or less completely from search and rescue, which they had done previously. So they do not actively look for migrant ships anymore and push them back. They just don't do search and rescue operations any longer. And they also don't do active disembarkation any longer. Instead, they convince third states to do the job instead. The classic example would be Libya, a war-torn country where the European Union invests quite some money to build up a functioning Libyan Coast Guard. Because if the Libyan Coast Guard saves the people and brings them back to Italy, and let's go back to that picture here on the top left. If the Libyan Coast Guard saves the people and brings them back to Libya, the Italians can have clean hands. They are not responsible for it, even though Libya has, of course, been funded by the European Union to do so. And I will finish with one very last example, which maybe brings, which I still find the most fascinating one to illustrate the hypocrisy of the European asylum policy, and that is the court judgments, which was decided also by the same court which extended human rights extraterritorially in 2020. And this concerns a land border, this time the land border between Spain and Italy. Spain has for 500 years had two exclaves in Morocco, that's Spanish territory, and there are border crossings, so you can enter legally into Spain from Morocco without crossing the Mediterranean, and you can also apply for asylum at these border crossing points. EU law applies, you can apply for asylum, all perfectly fine. The Spanish actually respect the law in that respect. They accept asylum applications at border crossing points. So why do these people from countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, what used to be called Sub-Sahara Africa, why do they climb across the border fence, which is 7 meters high and very dangerous to climb across? You can die. And why don't they proceed to the border crossing point to apply for asylum? Well, quite simple. As UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, observed, and as it was cited in the judgment, in reality, migrants from sub-Saharan Africa did not have access to the asylum procedures at the authorized border crossing point in Melilla, as they were systematically prevented from reaching the border on the Moroccan side. Why and how? The Moroccan police engages in racial profiling. Anyone who looks not Arab, who is not a Syrian, but who looks sub-Saharan, is prevented from reaching the Spanish border. That, of course, the Moroccan police does partly because it's a sovereign state who wants to control its border, but it's also or mainly because the European Union is invested an awful lot of money, resources, and is also giving political concessions so that the Moroccans cooperate in stopping or reducing the numbers of arrivals to the European territory. And that, I think, is quite a telling expression. I mean, that's on the top, on the bottom right, you see a picture of the Spanish Prime Minister and the Moroccan King who met for dinner last May, and they agreed on a fabulous new cooperation, political concessions, economic cooperation, and of course, always the not so hidden agenda that Morocco keeps on preventing migrants and refugees from reaching the border crossing points where they could apply for asylum in accordance with European law. That's, of course, quite hypocrite, and that is what academic observers have described quite loudly in recent years. But as we saw with the visa requirements, it's nothing new. It has happened for decades. And if you read the post-colonial literature, you'll find out that it even goes back much further. Even at the time of the Geneva Convention, which was signed in 1951, it was limited to Europeans. And even when it was extended to countries from the global south, they didn't change the very narrow refugee definition, even though it was obvious that it was insufficient to cover refugee movements in the global south. So we have had a sort of organized hypocrisy for many years. It's only in recent years that in the field of migration and asylum, it has become so much more visible. And that has to do with well, the visibility of the issue on television screens every evening. For the US, that's something which has been ongoing for some 20, 25, 30 years. For Europe, it's still a fairly new development. It only started some 10 or 15 years ago. And I hope that one area where Europe will not follow the US example, so where we can observe a difference in the foreseeable future, is that the Europeans also respond to that sense that they have somehow lost control and that too many people are arriving, not in the same way the Americans have done, because in America, it's certainly one of the topics which has contributed to this massive internal polarization. And Europe is on the way to that, but not yet there. And I personally hope that it will not happen. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Daniel, for this fascinating presentation. I certainly learned a lot. Okay, so we don't have a discussant for today, so we're just going to open it up right away to questions. So if you want to take a minute, write your question in the chat, or just raise your hand. Use the reactions button at the bottom and click raise hand, and we can call on you, and you can communicate your question right directly. So I see a hand from Zoe Sigmund, and if you don't mind introducing yourself, that would be great.
Hey, my name is Zoe Sigmund. I am an exchange student at UCLA. I go to school at the Hattie School in Berlin, Germany, and working on my Master's of Public Policy. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how the election of Prime Minister Meloni in Italy will affect EU migration policy, if at all.
Well, it's a fascinating case somehow. I'm also, as an academic, my self-perception is to be primarily analytical. And Ms. Meloni is a fascinating case because Ms. Meloni comes from a post-fascist party. She describes herself to be a post-fascist, so she's not a fascist any longer, but post-fascist, whatever that means. And she has also campaigned on an agenda which was very strict in migration, and she is undoubtedly very strict. But at the same time, she tries to find a solution, whatever, from her perspective, which is sustainable. And that's a difference between Ms. Meloni and all the other populist actors which we have across Europe, which really go after the quick, what seems to be like a quick win. She really, I think, has understood that these quick solutions do not work in the long run. So she's really working on precisely the kind of agenda which I presented in the third part of my presentation on externalisation. That's her big thing. She was one of the central actors behind the cooperation which is ongoing between the EU and Tunisia at the moment, which has partly failed, but not completely. And the very idea is that Tunisia should do the job for the Europeans. And there were two components which were envisaged. One idea was, and that was the ideal which Ms. Meloni pursued, that Tunisia should agree to be a safe third country, to really take back not only Tunisians, but also people from Nigeria and Senegal who tried to cross to Italy, and then Italy would be allowed to bring these people back to Tunisia, where they would receive an asylum procedure in a sort of external processing. That was the ideal which Ms. Meloni pursued. Tunisia did not agree, but Tunisia agreed in the framework of a broader deal to enhance border controls. And in a way, that's quite representative of a more general phenomenon, which I always find quite fascinating. Also, not only in Italy, also even in Germany, at this very moment in time, politicians are calling for this external processing. Let's create refugee camps in Tunisia and let's actively send people back to Tunisia so that they are processed there. These endeavors fail, mostly because no third state is willing to host these camps. No third state is willing to visibly do the dirty job, so to say, of the Europeans. By contrast, all these third states, Tunisia, Turkey, Morocco, Libya, they are willing to more invisibly control outward movements towards Europe. So to prevent or at least reduce the number of people who come to Europe. So there is a fascinating, I'm not a political scientist and international relations specialist, but it seems to me that there is really a fascinating example that states in the global south, if North Africa is still the global south, first of all, they have a population of their own, of course. The governments must look after their own legitimacy, and they have agency, and they use that agency. And in the same way as Europeans want the visible safe third country solution to show to their public that they have found a solution to the migration issue, these Northern African states reject precisely this because they don't want to be like the neo-colonial people accepting orders from Europeans, but at the same time, they are willing to prevent onwards movements to Europe, which is, of course, much less visible. So in a way, that's very fascinating. And Ms. Meloni, we'll see how it all turn out. I mean, she's undoubtedly very restrictive, but so far she has followed, let's say, a more rational agenda. I don't say it's good or bad, than other populist politicians who always call for easy fixes, which are just symbols and nothing more.
Thank you. So I see a couple more hands up, but I'm gonna turn to a question in the Q&A from Mariam Abdallah. Regarding EU federalism, the EU adopts legislation and the domestic authorities implement an interpretation of that legislation. But what role exactly do national governments play? I couldn't quite understand. Additionally, what is defined as an irregular entry, and why particularly are the amount of irregular entries of such concern that such measures have been taken to discourage them?
Sorry, yeah. That gives me the opportunity to go back to one of the slides, which I did not use here at the top right. So why, I start with the second question. So why are the number, first of all, whether a number is big or small is a question of perspective, obviously. I was, and I will answer with the American side. In February, I was invited to a conference in Panama, and there were lots of people from Central America, also Colombia and Mexico. And they said repeatedly, we don't understand why is everyone talking about these mere 300,000 crossing the American border, the US-Mexican border, if at the same time we have more than 1 million Venezuelans living in Bogota. So numbers are a question of perspective. And also on the North American continent, these 300,000 can be put into perspective if you look at the number of Venezuelans in particular, which are a neighboring state. And it's the same, of course, on the European continents. It's all a question of perspective. So why do these numbers matter? It's the top right. I think the numbers have increased. They were lower 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But more importantly, maybe there is a perception in the general public that politicians have lost control, that they are not able to find an appropriate solution. At this very moment in Germany, there's a very lively debate, and in opinion polls, 70–80% of the people tell say in the polls, the government doesn't have a good idea of what to do with migration. So there's a sense of less of control. And that, of course, has to do first with rising numbers, but also with the mobilization by what in political science you call political entrepreneurs. And that's mainly populist right-wing parties who constantly bring up the migration topic again and again, because for them it's as a mobilizing device for voters and supporters. And that is one of the reasons why migration has across Europe become one of the salient topics. Nowadays you lose or win elections by talking about migration and saying what you do about migration. And I've read some empirical studies that generally speaking, migration policies or asylum policies more specifically tend to become more restrictive if asylum becomes salient. So I think it has to do a lot with perceptions. And regarding the European federalism, well, governments play a crucial role because they also sit in what is called the European Council. It's like the American Senate, only that the senators are not elected directly by the population, but they are appointed by the governments of the member state, or they are actually representatives of the government of the member state. So in the council, we have not independent councillors or senators, but we have member state governments, and they, together with the European Parliament, decide the laws. So they're not only implementing something which Brussels has done, but they are sitting at the table in Brussels constantly and negotiating what the European law should be.
Thank you, Danny. Next, let's turn to a hand up by Hiroshi Motomura.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. This is really super valuable. I have a question that I think takes you a little bit beyond this is Hiroshi Motomura. I'm a professor at the law school at UCLA. I'm faculty co-director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy. I have a question I know takes you outside your remarks, but I think it feels like it's relevant, or at least I'm going to ask you how these relate to what you have addressed. And that is, your focus has understandably been on the asylum system. But there are a couple of mechanisms that as you know well, that move away from that focus. And I know that each could be its own talk, but I'm curious how you would see these connected to what you have addressed. One is subsidiary protection, temporary protection directive, and how that represents a decision-making process that is sort of in between asylum and no asylum. And related to that is something that I don't know if this is the case in other EU countries, but in Germany, it's the Chancenaufenthaltsrecht, the opportunity for people who get the Duldung or some form of tolerance to convert to other forms of long-term stay. And the reason these are important, or the reason I asked the question, is because the temporary protection or subsidiary protection seems to be a way to provide protection that is not asylum. And the Chancenaufenthaltsrecht strikes me as a method to regularize people who have a nominally temporary status, but who can make it permanent. And so these two things both move away from the asylum system. And I'm curious how you think of this as suggesting, or possibly not suggesting, new directions for overall policy. Thanks.
Thanks. I mean, temporary protection, there are two elements to it. The first element, because you also mentioned subsidiary protection, the definition of asylum is much broader in Europe than it is, to my understanding, in the US, although in the US you have also these parole schemes and the like, but there is an individual right. So if you apply for asylum, the authorities check whether you will receive what is called international protection or not, and that is either persecution under the Refugee Convention, or the alternative is subsidiary protection, and that's essentially fleeing indiscriminate violence in war situations. It would not technically cover gangs like in Central America, but they could also be covered on the basis of human rights. I mean, let's just leave aside the small print. So the definition of what I would call asylum is much broader in Europe than it is in the US. Refugee Convention plus all these other non-refoulement obligations. So what in on the American continent is the Cartagena obligation. Cartagena Declaration is part of EU law. It's binding EU law. And that's the first element to temporary protection. And temporary protection is more or less the same, but slightly more generous. But the second element, and that brings us back to this hypocrisy argument, temporary protection was a directive, I won't go into the small print, this was activated last year when Russia attacked Ukraine. There were, within a couple of 3 weeks, literally millions of Ukrainians leaving the country, because remember, at the beginning, it seemed as if Russian tanks would just conquer the country as a matter of weeks. That fortunately did not happen. And Europeans said any Ukrainian coming to Europe is welcome. And they didn't need a visa in the first place because visa requirements didn't exist. They were not even required to show a passport to cross the border. All these requirements were waived. They could choose freely within the European Union where to go, and they were automatically granted protection status without a complex procedure. That has to do also with administrative capacities. They mainly enter via Poland, Czech Republic, and elsewhere. So the asylum system there would have collapsed immediately if they had been required to do a procedure. So there were also practical bureaucratic considerations. But this whole thing, welcoming Ukrainians while at the same time actively pursuing externalisation or restriction policies in the Mediterranean, these two things go hand in hand. This, in the eyes of many, shows, or this I think shows quite well, the hypocrisy which has probably, or the double standards which have defined European or the Western asylum policies ever since the Second World War. Western states generally were very welcoming to people fleeing communist East Germany. They were very welcoming to Vietnamese and other Indochine people who fled communist regimes in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, they have always been quite restrictive towards other people from especially the global South who fled contexts and conflicts where the political, where one couldn't show one's political credentials so much. So that's temporary protection. So Chancenaufenthaltsrecht, that's a completely different thing. That's a regularization theme. So if you are illegally staying, if you are obliged to leave the country, undocumented, whatever term you prefer, you can qualify for a residence permit. It's one of 8 legalization schemes which exist in Germany, 6 to 10, depending on how you count. And these schemes work very well. Each year, 20,000 people get regularization within Germany, even though they are technically illegal, and you can get it as quick as after 18 months. So it can be really fast. And at the same time, 20,000 people are deported. So the numbers fluctuate from year to year, but it's more or less the same. And that, I think, if you contrast it to the US, is quite different. So Germany deports as many people as it grants residence permits, legal residence to people who are legally obliged to leave the country.
Thank you.
Next, we have a question from Miyako Yuba.
Hi, my name is Miyako. I'm an undergraduate sociology student at UCLA. And my question is, I'm currently taking a comparative immigration class with Professor Waldinger, who's in this Zoom right now. And we're talking about like the importance of like border patrol and, you know, what's the importance of like the policies that each country, nation, state has. And I know you were talking about that some states have put up their own kind of like border fence. Do you know which other states are going to do that and what kind of policies that they're going to implicate for that?
I don't know which states will do it. I also cannot name you all the states, but there is a very good Wikipedia site which lists you all the border fences which have popped up across Europe in recent years. And these border fences, I think I would always approach them from a double perspective. First of all, they are, of course, actual locations where migration control takes place. So they are hurdles. They are hurdles which do not only complicate the journey, but they actually impede some people from entering. If the border fence is strict, I mean, some will cross it, some will find alternative routes, but some will be prevented or not tried in the first place. So I think they are in themselves mechanisms of border controls, which to a certain extent work from if you adopt the government logic. But I think they are more. They are, and there's very good work by anthropologists, I think, Nicolas de Genova, who describes them as theaters. And there's an American, I think, sociologist or political scientist, Wendy something, I forgot the name, who wrote a whole book about that. They are essentially symbols. They are also symbols where the state projects power towards the external sphere, towards migrants, towards third states, but also towards its own population, so internally. So it's a symbol with which states counter this perception of loss of control, which parts of the population, whether we like it or not, seem to have. And if you have powerful symbols which are a showcase of state power, then these symbols can counter the reaction, because I said earlier, border fences and walls actually prevent people from entering. So to a certain extent they work, but of course they do not work fully. And in that respect, I think they are also symbols, and that's also how I approach it. As a lawyer, that's all non-legal, but I don't want to, with the legal elements, like to also mention one legal element, and I mentioned it briefly, it's really somehow perplexing. This legislation say you can apply for asylum at the border, but what does it actually mean? If you stand at the border fence and say you want to apply for asylum, probably my sort of gut feeling is that probably the law doesn't require the border officer to cut a hole in the fence. And I've discussed that with European Commission officials, and it's not a clear-cut solution. So in a way that also shows that border fences can work, but many will of course circumvent it, and in many cases they just mean, as Hiroshi will write in his great forthcoming book, more dangerous journeys, and create a loss of suffering and also loss of life in the European case, not only in the European case.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. There's a question in the chat. A little bit up here, this is from Antonio Mele, who is asking, how often is asylum granted in the EU? In America, we have a decreasing rate of asylum grants and a rise in deportation.
Yes, asylum is granted very often. I mean, the numbers, of course, fluctuate. First of all, they fluctuate between member states, but they also fluctuate over the years. It also depends on who enters via the external borders. Overall, a rough guess, I haven't checked the data, is that 50% at least receive a protection status, and that has to do with the fairly broad definition of international protection on the European continent. But it really differs between also the border segments. In the central Mediterranean, so in Italy, most of the people come from either North Africa or West Africa, and they are mostly rejected. So they are obliged to leave the country again. Some, of course, are not, but on a whole, they are more rejected. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, you have mostly Afghans, Iraqis, and Syrians entering. No Palestinians so far, or little Palestinians so far, and at least Syrians and Afghans mostly receive protection status. But then you have also differences between the European Union. That's then this very peculiar federal setup where we have this EU law, and law is, of course, when it comes to the definition of asylum, it's reasonably abstract. We have EU legislation which specify what persecution is, and then we have judgments against specifying it, but still there are quite some differences between the member states regarding recognition rates, but the recognition rates, the positive outcomes are reasonably high, and the number of deportations are much lower than in the United States. Also, the number of the number of people being detained is much lower than in the United States. That also has to do with legislation, which I will not show you. It's in one of the slides, but that I find always quite, I mean, if you see also these pictures of these American prisons, of course, we have camps in Europe as well, but most of them are actually not technically prisons. You can leave these camps. Often they are, of course, in very rural area on a Greek islands, and then you can leave it, but then you are in the forest or on a somehow scrub area on a Mediterranean island. You cannot really do much, but not very many people are actually imprisoned in Germany. It exists, and it affects many people, and it's of course a severe restriction of liberty, but there are major differences on that front between the US and Europe. And if you want, especially, but we have few legal scholars, I guess, but the case law, especially of the European Court of Human Rights regarding the right to liberty and how it applies to immigration detention is something which Americans might find inspiring.
Danny, I wanted to ask you a question. I don't know, you feel free to push back and tell me that this is outside the scope of your expertise, but I'm thinking a lot about what the governors of Texas and Florida are doing, for example, sending refugees up or asylum seekers up to Chicago or to New York, San Diego. What are do you know what are the legal ramifications of this? What are the legal implications of doing something like this? Is this even is this legal what they're doing? Yeah, I guess that's my question.
I mean, for all I understand, in the US case, they do it with the consent of the people. So I don't think anyone is, technically speaking, forced to go to New York. But that's at least what I read in the New York Times. That's my source in this case, that these people actually, they wait, they say, here's a bus to New York. If you want to board it, it's free. And then they wait till it's full, and then it drives off to New York. That's what I read. So I think if it is with the consent of the people from the human rights perspective, I wouldn't see a problem. It's, of course, a completely different matter how you approach it from the perspective of US constitutional law, and whether there's something like bona fide obligations not to behave in a way which affects the interests of other states. But that's a matter of US constitutional law. But again, my intuition is that from a legal perspective, it's probably, unless you can approach it from a constitutional law perspective, not legal. It's the same debate in Europe, by the way. Their states are not, and there it's of course different member states. It's a big issue, because also the degree refugees, asylum applicants, and also refugees receive quite different treatment in different member states. And that results in what in Europe is called secondary movement. So it's people who are technically obliged to stay in, let's say, Greece or Italy, who then move on to Germany. And then Germany could theoretically return them to Greece or Italy. And Italy at the moment refuses to take back anyone. So they officially stopped take back. So that's in a way the European equivalent. It's just the other way around. And then under EU law, which again is very protective on that front, they receive a second asylum procedure in Germany if after 6 months. So we have these debates as well. And I think they also show, I mean, in the American case, Texas and others are sponsoring it, they are supporting it. But I assume that even if they didn't support it, quite some people would sooner or later move on once they had the money or also the logistical knowledge and skills how to do it. Because if you are in a federal state, I'm actually unaware of it, but Hiroshi might want to say something about that. I don't know if he's still there.
Well, I am, but I mean, I think you hit on the issue of the voluntariness of this. Some of the challenges of this have had to do with deception or accusations of deception, and I don't know to what extent those are well founded, or they're founded in certain circumstances, not others.
Yeah. Thank you. And then one more question from Zoe Sigmund.
Hey, sorry, just one more question. I know that Germany is poised to start relaxing some of its migration policies, and the AfD is like pretty opposed to that, and there's a growing support for the AfD. But I'm curious how you think those policies might interact with asylum granting policies or procedures in Germany.
I mean, Germany is really a good example. I mean, some of you, especially, I don't know, if we have undergrad students, some of you might still remember Miss Merkel and this German welcome culture, how in 2015, which for you is 8 years ago and you were still in school. So that's when you realize that you turn older than 2015 seems like yesterday. But Miss Merkel, who has this very welcoming policy, which, by the way, was in practice not only welcoming, because at the same time she negotiated an agreement with the Turkish President Erdogan that he would prevent people from leaving Turkey and take them back in case they went to Greece. But that in a way was very representative of what European states, and that brings me back to my presentation, have done for many years. Internally, they were very generous, welcoming human rights, universal values, refugee protection, but invisibly and externally, so that the population wouldn't really see and realize it, they pursued quite some restrictive policies, and so did Ms. Merkel. So for many years, Germany was very welcoming, and what we have seen over the past maybe 10 years is a sort of domino effect. At the beginning, we had only 1 or 2 countries who were the opponents of Germany, who wanted a really strict policy. Hungary was the quintessential opponent of Ms. Merkel. The opponent was Viktor Orban, the prime minister. And we have seen a domino effect with more and more countries shifting towards restrictive policies. And until half a year ago, it was essentially Portugal, Ireland, Germany, and Luxembourg, which in this Council of Ministers, where national ministers are discussing laws, were still promoting really open and generous, reasonably open and generous asylum legislation. And now Germany is about to change as well. And that has to do, of course, with the rise of populist parties, but it also has to do with the sense among especially local mayors and the like, that they have reached a certain capacity limit of what they can deal with. Because to also highlight another difference between the American and the German system, it's of course the welfare state. Asylum applicants, in accordance with EU law, receive housing. They receive an appropriate standard of living, which in Germany means they receive 400 euros a month in cash or in kind benefits, in de facto benefits. So that's the welfare state, which makes a difference. And that also means if you have the arrival of, in the case of Germany, over the past 18 months, 1 million Ukrainians, plus over the past 18 months, 400,000 to 500,000 asylum applicants. It's more than 1 year, 18 months. It's a lot, and that is, like in the New York case, a problem for public resources, and it's mayors who of the past months have also built up the pressure. And then you have the populist party, the AfD, being successful in election, and now Germany appears to be, and that I would say from an analytical perspective, appears to be the next domino thing which falls into a more restrictive policy. And we can expect that to have a trigger-on effect on the European level, because if now Germany openly becomes more restrictive, other governments will probably follow suit and or pursue an even more restrictive asylum policies. I do not know exactly what that means in practical terms. I mean, we have these German policy developments, but they are mainly symbol. The decisive thing is what happens at the European level. And to conclude with just one example, prominent politicians only, or several prominent politicians this week came out with the idea of this externalized asylum procedures, hiring third states, so which we can save send back the asylum applicant to these states so that they receive an asylum procedure there. It's of course mostly conservative politicians, but also social democrats, and some governments, in the few social democratic governments which are still governing in Europe. It's the one in especially Denmark who have embraced a really strict asylum policy. Denmark is one of the strictest countries in Europe. They openly pursue a zero asylum seeker policy, and it was introduced by a social democratic government. So I don't think that will happen in Germany, but Germany will somehow join the European mainstream as well. That I think now is quite apparent.
Thank you. A question from Hiroshi?
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up on my prior inquiry into Chancenaufenthaltsrecht and sort of the law that allows people to convert temporary status to more permanent, because I guess I didn't understand, or maybe I didn't appreciate the nuances of your answer, because you suggest the Chancenaufenthaltsrecht, or this type of mechanism, was a separate topic, and I thought of it as very, very closely tied. And so I should explain why, and maybe you can tell me why there's a gap in my knowledge, or that I didn't ask the question properly. You mentioned that protection in the European Union includes Geneva Convention, asylum, the refugee definition, but also includes subsidiary protection. So I been assuming that a number of people who receive this as subsidiary protection receive a sort of what in German I guess would be called a Duldung, a toleration. They don't. Okay, so maybe that's the gap. What is their status that they receive at that point?
And just to, I mean, I said at the beginning that I will focus really on access to the territory, because already, I mean, you realized I had a bit more slides, even though I'm quite experienced as a speaker, and I managed to somehow cut it down while speaking. Even that was a lot, obviously, so I had to cut it down. And it was about access to the territory, so it didn't speak about what happens after. I also didn't speak in the talk about the scope of the refugee definition or the like. So in that respect, no, people who have subsidiary or temporary protection, they receive a residence permit, full stop. It's a temporary one to start with, but in Europe, generally, we don't have this distinction between temporary residence and immigration, which is more long-term, but you usually start with a temporary residence permit, which can then be prolonged, and after 5 or 6 years you can receive an like a permanent residence status. So in Germany, generally it's more you come in on a temporary basis, which will then be prolonged, and after a couple of years, and if you fulfill a certain number of conditions, you will upgrade your status to a permanent one. And we have no numerical caps or anything. So once you fulfill the conditions, you move in a direct line from temporary status to citizenship. So it's a sort of steps. It's like a step. I mean, you walk up from steps to steps, you get upgraded. And people with subsidiary protection, it was different in the 90s. So I don't know whether you remember that debate, but ever since 2004, people with subsidiary protection or also other non-refoulement protection statuses, they receive a residence permit. So the Chancenaufenthaltsrecht is really for people whose application for asylum has been rejected on all grounds. And they can still, so it's really legalization of an irregular status after the refusal of an asylum application, but also if for other reasons.
Okay, that clarifies things for me. And but the reason I asked the question is because there are people who have asylum claims, who seek asylum, who self-identify as asylum seekers, who lose their cases completely, but then are somehow allowed to stay through the Duldung, and then can legalize, as you put it, later. So in that sense, it breaks down the dichotomy between people who are successful asylum seekers and unsuccessful asylum seekers, and so that's I think that makes sense. That's the reason I asked about that particular regularization mechanism, because and I appreciate the fact that I was taking you outside the scope of your question, but I think thinking about the asylum system in Europe requires thinking about what are either alternatives to the asylum system or loopholes, depending on your perspective.
Yes, and let's maybe also, because I guess we will come to a close sooner or later, maybe as a follow-up, maybe also on a more positive side. I mean, Europe, much more so than the US, is confronted with what we call demographic change, which simply means we are very old societies and we are getting older by the day. Germany was among the first country to really now start feeling demographic change, because the baby boomers will retire at the end of this decade and there will be massive labor shortage. So Germany needs immigration. Still, it's the people who enter via the asylum system, they do not necessarily succeed on the labor market, also for reasons of qualification, but that really opens the room for a more positive debate, and that's part of my book project about migration. And you can also use that, that's not part of my book project, to develop new ideas which overcome this, this really negative perception. And the German government actually wants to sponsor it. The European Union has been sponsoring it for many years, but quite unsuccessfully. The EU calls it nowadays talent partnership. They used to call it mobility partnership. The EU Germany just calls it migration agreement, Migrationsabkommen. And the idea is, well, we have people who enter irregularly via the asylum seekers, who have an asylum system whose asylum application is rejected. They are obliged to leave the country. That is not really much appreciated by the general public. So let's ideally convince countries of origin to take them back. And in return, we will open legal migration channels for workers from the same country. It will not usually be the same people, because also qualification level differ. But in countries such as Nigeria, Morocco or the like, you have a very young population. It's just the opposite of Europe. Many of them are nowadays actually fairly well qualified because they have reasonably good schools, universities and the like. They also have much poverty and so on, but they also have a reasonably good education system. And the population is so young that the economy is not actually capable of absorbing all these young people. So they have unemployment, especially, by the way, among university graduates. So that offers the opportunity of a win-win situation, or to be more precise, it's the win-win-win-lose situation, because someone loses, the person who will be deported, but Germany wins, or the politicians, the government wins, the country of origin wins, and the legal migrant who gets an opportunity to enter the German labor market wins. And I think that's one of the models how you can ideally overcome the vicious circle. Surprisingly, Ms. Meloni, whom we spoke about earlier as well, is thinking about the same scheme with Tunisia, because Italy is also confronted with a massive demographic change. So even Ms. Meloni is starting to subscribe to the idea. So that's, I think, a more positive narrative, which maybe has also the potential, if it works, if it works, to prevent Europe going down the American route of an ever more polarized public discourse, which at some point is so polarized that there might be no way out in the American case.
All right, we have time for one more question, and I see a hand up by Ayelet Shahar.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Daniel. Great to see you. And Hiroshi and others in the room that I'm very familiar with. I have a quick question for you. I came in late, so you might have covered it. But how do you think the new pact on migration and asylum, the EU-wide one, will impact any of these trends that you have explored? Because I would assume it's quite relevant. So if you could just share with us some of your thoughts on this and the directions, and would it just exacerbate the kind of trends that you have witnessed? Would it change them? What do you see as central to it? What are the challenges? So if you could share that with us.
Yes, no, thanks. Thanks for being present, and also thanks for the question. It's, of course, I didn't mention it in the talk because 30 minutes is a limited time. The EU is currently undergoing a reform of its asylum legislation, and many things will become stricter. That's, I think, the quintessence of the reform, but also all the things which I presented, access to the asylum procedure and the like, will not change, which, by the way, is why Poland and Hungary voted against the reform, because they wanted more. They wanted really an authority to suspend the right to asylum in the way the Trump administration and then the Biden administration did it under Title 42 during COVID. And they wanted it not during COVID, but in situations of instrumentalization where neighboring states such as Belarus facilitate the entry and transit of potential asylum applicants to destabilize the EU or to exercise political pressure. They didn't get it. So I followed that in close detail, and I could say, I could speak hours about it, but my take in a nutshell is that it is more restrictive on many fronts, but it's not really altering the system fundamentally. But that also means that all the problems which the European asylum system has will continue. And one of the real problems, which I haven't really talked about either, but I only mentioned it in the Q&A, is the internal, what is called secondary movements, that migrants move from state A to state B, and there is nothing in the legislation which really changes much on that front. And that is relevant for the policy debate, because these internal debates about solidarity and secondary movement are toxic. The Italians say, we take too many, and then the Germans say, but the Italians don't take anyone back, and they end up in Germany nonetheless. And both are in a way correct. Many arrive in Italy. It's actually too many. They don't get support. But then at the end of the day, they move on to Germany or elsewhere. So they're also correct. And that's a toxic situation. And if the Europeans internally cannot agree on a reasonable way forward, especially regarding the internal distribution of asylum applicants, then the easy solution is to pass the buck outwards and to say it's like a hot potato, no one wants them, so at some point, well, the potato falls to the floor, but bad metaphor, it means it's just, it results in more externalization. So the inability of the Europeans to develop a reasonably functioning internal solidarity mechanism, and that also goes back to Claire's questions about Texas and New York. I mean, if Texas and New York fight, maybe the easy way out is you just try to have less people coming in, because then the fight might be less toxic. And that's, at least, I don't want to speculate about the US, but that is what we have been observing on the European continent for years. This pact, which you mentioned, is a policy document of 2020. We have the legislation as part of it. Not much happened on that front. But there is one element of the pact, almost half the pages, which is alive and kicking, and that is externalization. So whenever European leaders meet, and you had one quote on the slides with a picture of the European Council, they agree on externalization, because that's the only thing they agree upon, enlisting third states to do the job. But then we also saw Tunisia was the example, that the third states are actually not willing to do the job. So it's easy for the Europeans to say, well, let's the Tunisians do it, or for the German politicians now this week, let's externalize the asylum procedure, and then the problem is solved. But of course, the third states have an agenda, they have agency, and they have a public opinion as well. But what I still find then most fascinating, and that's what I try to bring across also in the talk, all these official cooperation doesn't really work very well. These externalization schemes do not fly, but what works, also with countries which would never accept external processing, is that they prevent, or at least try to prevent, the number of departures towards Europe. Morocco does it, Tunisia does it, Libya does it, and that I still find somehow fascinating. I'm not a political scientist, but I think it has to do with the political economy of migration policies, that just, and now I repeat myself, that the former colonies are not willing to openly do the dirty job, so to say, of the Europeans, but they are willing to nonetheless control it. And that also has to do, I was once on a trip with a German political foundation to Senegal, and I asked the Spanish ambassador, how do you actually manage to convince the Senegalese to cooperate in terms of preventing departures? And he said, very easy. I mean, the Coast Guard has also an agenda. It has its self-esteem. We invite them to Spain, we buy them a new ship, and we cooperate on a regular basis. So even within Senegal, the Coast Guard has its own institutional logic. And if you build up the Coast Guard, they might be willing to do a job which maybe other parts of the government and the society are not willing to do. But now I move to a different topic.
All right, well, this brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions and your attention. And thank you to Dr. Thym for a fascinating presentation and discussion. Please join us in 2 weeks on Zoom. We will be hearing from Nancy Fonner's latest research. Have a great Friday and have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.